Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, for invitation to participate in this conference. I lived in Oregon for 22 years. I did my doctorate at the University of Oregon in educational leadership with a focus on bilingual instruction and English learner supports. So I'm very excited to be here with you, sharing what I know, and also kind of learn from you what is going on in Oregon around English learners. So I just wrote a little bit of an agenda to kind of guide our presentation today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and then kind of focus on the characteristics of English learners, like who are they, what are their assets, what are their challenges. And then we're going to go a little bit into the assessment of English learners. What do we know about assessing them in terms of their language development, as well as their reading skills? And then we'll delve into the instruction, like how can we support them in the classroom? So just kind of like, so you know, a little bit, I lived in Oregon for 22 years, but I really was born in Brazil. And then from Brazil, I moved to Colombia, where I lived for 12 years, and then to Mexico at 10 years, where I lived for 10 years. And I studied psychology at in Mexico City at the Universidad Iberoamericana before coming to the States. Then I came to the States. I did a master's in Latin American Studies at San Diego, and then my doctorate at University of Oregon. And I have been now in Texas for 10 years. So I left Oregon to come to Texas and work with research here, although my soul and my always heart is with Oregon. My two kids were born there, and I love to come and, as I was saying, sharing my knowledge and what I've learned with you. But I also have done quite a bit of research in other countries. So I have done research with Chilean researchers, with researchers from the Canary Islands in Spain. I have done research with Finnish researchers, and then also in Qatar. So it's kind of like a little bit scattered all over different places. And I grew up speaking Portuguese at home, and then I spoke in Spanish, you know, in Colombia, the societal language, mostly outside of school. I went to a German school all my life, well, until I finished high school. And so really German was my second language, well, perhaps my third language, and then English was actually my fourth language. So I have been navigating the spaces of English learners and different linguistic systems for quite a bit, which I think hopefully has helped me understand also like firsthand, what does it mean to be an English learner. And so two of the areas that I'm really interested now in developing more, one is on technology. So I really want to know how we can leverage technology, particularly virtual tutoring, to support English learners in their language development, and also as well as content development. So I've been working on developing an intervention for in science and social studies, where students learn vocabulary on their own through the computer, an interactive computer program, and then they, with the idea that they then will be able to provide more sophisticated explanations and engage in rich discussions around science or social studies topics. And our findings indicated that the program worked well, and that students learned the words that they were taught significantly better than students in the control group who did not have that opportunity. And then my other area of research that I'm passionate about is working with parents. So I really want to learn how we can support parents, particularly Latino parents, in their education of their children, and particularly in developing their academic skills and assets. So those are kind of like my two passions right now, and I'm very glad to be able to share some of the findings with you. All right, so who are English learners, no? And what does the research say about them, and how can we differentiate, for example, language development from a learning disability? Now, I think that those are questions that we still don't have the answers for, and we're still kind of like trying to figure out what works and what is what can help us answer these questions. But we do know some things that I want to show with you, some of the research that we know about that. Yeah. So perhaps one of the first things to be aware of is the definition of who is a language and English learner. No, and an English learner, we can define it is a person, is a student whose language proficiency is not developed enough that they can benefit from English only instruction. So they need some additional supports. And it can be in their native language, it can be in English. I mean, as long as they have that support to build their content and to develop their content knowledge. And then, as you know, there are many different ways of calling English learners and defining them and labeling them. And I think that, you know, each researcher has their own reason for why they call them something and or something else. But for me, the two main constructs that I think are important is English learners. I refer to English learners when I'm talking about any student who speaks a native language other than English and doesn't benefit from English only instruction. But then I also sometimes call them bilingual students. Particularly, I refer to bilingual students when they are in the bilingual program. No, and so I think that they are developing both languages together. So those are kind of the definitions I'm going to be using today, but they are not the only definitions for who an English learner is. Just kind of like in general terms. One of the things that also we can, you know, I've been made aware by looking at the data is also how much the immigrant population has grown, but particularly, as you can see on this slide, the Asian population. So the Asian population is actually much larger now than the Latin American population, but that doesn't mean that the needs and what we can do for English learners is the same. No? And so you can see that, of course, although we have a large Asian population, the languages that they speak are so varied that a very small percentage of English learners or immigrants from Asia speak the same language. No, while when we look at Spanish, we see that 73% of English learners speak Spanish. No? So there is a variability there, and moreover, in the U.S. we're speaking more like 400 languages or more. So sometimes when you are in a district, in a small district, you might be surrounded in a community, for example, of Vietnamese children, and so Vietnamese would be actually the most widely spoken language in the community where you are. No? So sometimes it's good to keep that in mind too, that we are not necessarily talking about a small population of students that are English learners that are across everywhere in the US, but sometimes they can be all in one community, and therefore the needs for that community is really towards the students who are speaking that specific language. So some things that are important to know, in the neuroscience particularly is teaching us, and I mean, really the advances in that field have really kind of like, I think, opened the eyes on how can we think about bilingual learners, and particularly English learners, because English learners also means that they have another language that they are speaking. And so some of the things that we know is that bilingual learners, they always activate their two languages at the same time. So and what happens is that, you know, based on the group of people that they are talking to, they suppress one language or the other, but both languages are actually active when you're speaking to an audience. And then, of course, you know, bilinguals also vary on linguistic, cognitive, experiential factors. So that always has to be taken into account. So not everybody, even, for example, with the Latino population particularly, not everybody is the same, has had the same experiences, have had the same language development in their native language and in English. No? So being aware of the differences is important, because we are kind of a growing majority, you know, of English learners. And then there are findings. I mean, bilingualism can be an asset, but sometimes it can also be a constraint, right? So we have to be aware of that too. Like, what is it that we want to use the bilingual education for, and what are the outcomes that we're testing? And based on that, you can really get different impressions of how bilinguals think, and what are their needs, as well as what are their assets. All right, and then finally, you know, the US is a bilingual country. So even though we sometimes think that bilinguals are not present, but we have been a bilingual country since its inception. And then another important fact, I think, is that 50% of the Spanish-speaking English learners, they are born in the US. So they have been here since they were born, and actually about 75% of them still speak Spanish. So, sometimes we hear the second and third generation immigrants, they forget their native language, but that hasn't happened with Spanish speakers. And so even if they are born here, they still know and speak Spanish. Now, other things that are important too is that with the neuroscience studies, I love to show even my students and people I talk to these brain images, because they kind of show how a bilingual brain tends to be more active than a monolingual brain. And that activity is good. It kind of like, the brain is like a muscle. So the more we practice, the more we use it, the more we develop it. So that's an advantage. And then when we look at the brain of a Spanish native language speaker versus an English as a second language speaker, you can see that also a person who is speaking the second language has much more brain activation, if we look at the lower brain figures here, than a person who is speaking just one language. No? So again, those are kind of assets and benefits from being bilingual. And so how does that relate in terms of what to bring to education, right? So one of their ways is like really a different sociocultural perspective, just the fact that we're bilingual, we have kind of experience with a different culture, a different way, language, a different approach to solving problems that can really enrich a classroom more than being a constraint. Other parts is also that the socialization, or how do we socialize with others, varies, and that can be enriching too for children, particularly, to learn that there are different ways of talking to each other, of collaborating, of playing and working with each other. And then the ability to see also problems from different perspectives. Just the fact that we have different experiences helps us also think about problems in a different way than when we have grown up in maybe one culture without being exposed to others. So those are kind of assets that we can really leverage when we are teaching English learners, whether it's with monolingual students or in dual language programs. Now, of course, there are challenges to bilingual education research, and although we know quite a bit, there's still a lot of questions about what is the optimal program for an English learner. I mean, are all the bilingual programs effective? We don't know that. And then we also don't know a lot about how to support them when they seem to be struggling or they appear to have maybe a learning disability. So there are still kind of things that the research is not clear about, but and then we still need to study more in depth. But what we do know, and some of the things, trajectories, is that, for example, vocabulary between bilingual students and monolingual students tend to stay kind of like at the same level. So teaching vocabulary and trying to close that gap between monolingual students and bilingual students seems to be very hard, and we're still quite haven't figured out how to do that. And I'll show you in a minute, I'm engaging a little bit more into this idea of having a bilingual language proficiency asset instead of comparing, for example, monolinguals and bilinguals in English, or for that matter, in Spanish speakers who are monolingual and bilingual in Spanish, to see if we can really kind of leverage that asset, because I do think that there is a bilingual asset that we, in particular in vocabulary, that we haven't quite explored quite yet, more in depth. Okay, all right. So, so meaningful differences, And so this book followed about 40 families for 4 years, and each year they went and they kind of assessed adult children conversations. And what they found is that there were meaningful differences between adults. Between groups of families. So, for example, families in Group A, children heard about 600 words per hour, while in Group C, children heard about 2,100 words per hour. And then if you multiply that for 4 years, it would be like Group A, children in Group A would be hearing about 13 million words compared to Group C that would hear 45 million words. So there was a very large difference between one group of students and the other. And not only that, but also the quality of the explanations were different. So families who kind of had more interactions with their children, they also had more positive interactions. So it was more like, oh, I'm glad you finished your homework on time. Thank you for cleaning your room. While families where there was not enough language, they were here, children were hearing more kind of negative feedback, like, for example, don't hit your child, don't hit your sister, go and clean your room, and be careful with the table not to fall. And so it's not only like the amount of language they heard, but also what they heard was different. And that, of course, you can imagine that affects language development, whether it's in the native language or the second language. So what are the needs of English learners? No? So English learners, obviously, they need to speak, read, write, and understand English, independently of whether they are in a bilingual program or in an English-only program. And then they need to understand content and academic language at the same time. They need to navigate the US education system that is significantly different from many other education systems. So understanding even how the system works is important. And then they really need to seek, or we all need to seek, opportunities for academic growth and success. No? So what are the elements that are necessary for second language acquisition? We need to do phonology, which is very connected to phonological phonemic awareness, where students understand that sounds, the sound system, and that a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. Morphology, where the small, where we are dealing with words and parts of words that are the smallest system of meaning, and that is very connected to vocabulary. They need to understand how the syntax works, and even though, for example, in Spanish and English, we know are both orthographic alphabetic systems, how we say a sentence, right, and how we write a sentence is very different in Spanish and in English. The syntax really varies. They need the vocabulary, semantics, and then pragmatics. So when do you talk a certain way? When do you use certain type of language, right? When you're socializing versus you're academically, and what are those parameters? No, and so those are all things that students who are second language learners need to know. The other thing that is important is that we have levels of proficiency. So, a newcomer, for example, we cannot expect them to even say sometimes a complete sentence if they have never been exposed to English, just because it's very difficult for them. I mean, that doesn't mean that nobody can do it, but we do have to start with, yes, no questions, pointing for students who are just newcomers and don't know the language, and then move into more emerging state, where students can perhaps respond in one-word answers. Then moving to the developing stage, or when they move to the developing stage, they can answer in phrases or can repeat the definition. For expanding, they are already starting to develop a little bit more of a sophisticated sentence and grammar. And then the teacher can explain the content, or they can start explaining the content. And then finally, with bridging, where students can definitely express themselves almost as a native speaker. No? And we want students to move from one level to the other, but being aware of what they can do with their language is really important, because what we don't want to do is necessarily always simplify the language for them, no? But it's more to think about activities that can leverage what they know, where they can, particularly for teaching content, that can support their language development, but also particularly their content knowledge. No, and that can be done independently of whether students are in level 1 or they are fully advanced proficient. And we'll talk a little bit about, what kind of ideas and strategies can be used for that. The other thing, of course, is that we have to take into account the language standards. And so students need to be proficient in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So ideally, every day, students should be engaged in activities that develop each of these domains. No. All right, but before knowing how to really provide the instruction, we need to understand that just like, the conference today, and I see that the triangle at Oregon ORTIi is the other way around, is that we need to provide students with the supports within what we call now a culturally and diverse response to intervention system. And one of the systems that we kind of developed a little bit based on the original response to intervention system is like a school-wide bilingual model. No? So if a school has a bilingual program, for example, then we need to understand that students have to be proficient in both languages, and the supports have to be in both languages in order for them to be successful and to be fully bilingual. Now, if you have a lot of English learners with very diverse backgrounds, you might not be able to develop to create a bilingual program. So, but we still need to assess all the students and have goals for them as well as the appropriate instruction. So how do we do that? First, with the assessments, right? I mean, we really have to have strong assessments that are formative, so they are quick, brief, standardized, provide us with good information that we can act on as teachers. And we also, the reality is that we also need to screen them, even if it's briefly, with some kind of a language assessment, so we know where students are in their language development. The other thing is that in Spanish, as well as in English, the core components of reading are the same because of the fact, as I was saying, it's an alphabetic language. The simple view of reading works in both languages. There have been studies done in many Latin American countries and Spain on that. So we can follow that same rule and way of thinking about developing students' core components of reading, just like we do in English with English monolingual students. We also want to be careful not to kind of like see the core components of reading as part of a continuum, but they need to really be taught simultaneously. So code-based instruction needs to happen every day, just like meaning-based instruction. No? So we cannot wait until we're in second grade until students are in second grade to start giving them more vocabulary and language proficiency activities or reading comprehension activities. So here are a couple of studies that we just completed recently that I want to show you, where we find that, for example, formative assessments, right? The challenge is, well, if you have a school that have a lot of English learners with different languages, how can we assess them all relatively early to provide them with the supports they need? And what we found, we conducted a study in the Pacific Northwest with a lot of schools from Oregon, actually, with 3,418 English learners. We wanted to know if the CUT scores that are currently using for these assessments that we use, which was DIBELS, were the same for English learners and English proficient students. And here you can see, let's look at, for example, in first grade, if we had nonsense word fluency as the predictor of reading comprehension in English, we can see that the CUT scores in English and the CUT scores for English only students and English learners were very similar. Yeah, in the fall and then in the winter, and then in the spring it varied a little bit, and sometimes for example, the targeted English learners had it actually was very similar even in the spring. Indicating that the CUT scores that were used, at least for this study, to assess or to determine students' level of risk in English could be used also for English learners. Yeah, and in that this was the same with nonsense word fluency as well as with oral reading fluency. So that was, I think that's an important evidence with a large number of students that we can use the same assessments for English learners and English only students. Now the other question is like, well, do the formative assessments provide us with the same type of information in Spanish and in English when we want to use also Spanish as evidence of students' abilities and risk status in their reading comprehension. And here, what we used were measures in Spanish and in English for a group of English learners, about 2,000 bilingual English learners in grades 1 and 2. And what we found is that and I'm going to focus on this one here, on grade 2 oral reading fluency. And we found that in the fall of grade 2, the CAT scores in English and Spanish were quite similar. But then in the middle of grade 2, the CAT scores in Spanish were a little bit lower than the CAT scores in English. And this is to predict English outcomes, yeah? And then in the spring of grade 2, really the best predictor of reading comprehension was actually oral reading fluency in English. So what this study has shown us is that we can, if we don't have the opportunity to assess students in their native language, we still can assess them and learn about where their language proficiency is. The Spanish assessment, if you have a bilingual program, is really important because it really gives us also an idea about how well their student Spanish reading skills predict English skills or predict Spanish skills, right? If you have a bilingual program, you want students to also be fluent in Spanish. And it can provide us with that information. So now, in a third study, and this is going to be the last one with data, but here is another one, a study that we just finished too, and which has just been published, is where we wanted to look at bilingual language proficiency. So we wanted to see if students, if bilingual language proficiency had an effect on reading comprehension in Spanish and in English at the end of second grade. And what we found is that, yes, bilingual language proficiency has an effect on first grade and second grade reading comprehension in both languages. And then we also found that Spanish and English oral reading fluency has an effect on reading comprehension in English. So it's a strong predictor of reading comprehension in English, as you can see here by these numbers in yellow. But when you look at Spanish reading comprehension, you can see that bilingual language proficiency, yes, is a strong predictor of reading comprehension in Spanish, and only oral reading fluency initial status is in Spanish is a predictor of reading comprehension in Spanish. So there is a difference between the outcomes, right? I mean, if the outcome is in English, you can use Spanish and English reading comprehension to predict reading Spanish and English decoding and oral fluency measures to predict reading comprehension in English. But for Spanish, really Spanish is the one that predicts the best how students will do in a reading comprehension measure in Spanish. All right, so based on that, we can kind of summarize and say that decoding and oral reading fluency are strong predictors of reading comprehension for English learners and for English-only students. And the second one is that decoding and oral reading fluency are strong predictors of reading comprehension in Spanish and in English. Bilingual language proficiency significantly predicts reading comprehension in Spanish and in English. And then really we can differentiate instruction for English learners based on the screening assessment. So the recommendation would be not to wait to assess English learners. Kindergarten, of course, you should assess them too, even in English if you don't have Spanish assessments. But take into account that if that's the first time the students have been in school, that their reading skills in kindergarten might be not necessarily like the best predictors of reading comprehension later on. Once they have been in school for a year, then like first grade, for example, it's really recommended that we assess them in both if we can, and if we have a bilingual program, for sure we should assess them in both. But also assessing them in English only is perfectly fine, and it will give us enough information to group and differentiate instruction for them. And here I just want to show you a little kind of a table that we have used to work with with schools that have a bilingual program. And so basically here, what you can see, for example, with student Karina, that she is at risk in oral reading fluency, and therefore she doesn't necessarily is in the same category, let's say, as Brandon or as Emmanuel, who have different CAT scores, or sorry, who have different scores on oral reading fluency in Spanish. No, so we want to look at both. Let's say both skills, no, Spanish and English, to determine which group students should be mostly placed to improve their instruction. And I see here there is I'm going to just stop for a minute to see if you have any other questions before we move on language proficiency assessments. And I see here there is a question about, is there a strong core K5 Spanish program that you recommend? I don't have a specific recommendation, but I do think that what is important for a Spanish program is to ensure that they also provide explicit instruction, just like the programs in English, and to really see if they have the same principles that we use for English in Spanish. It doesn't mean that, you know, we want to translate everything and the stories can be different, but what you want is that explicit direct instruction, particularly for those students who might be struggling. And the reality is that you will find, as you know, students who will be struggling in Spanish too. And then there's another question here. When you say we should be screening, what elements should be included on a screener? Oh, excellent. Yes. So I think the 5 core components of reading, so the 5 elements in reading should be included in a screener. Of course, reading comprehension is a little bit more complex to assess, but it can be done also with multiple choice questions or with inferential and literal questions on a text. But it should be the same ones. So we know that phonemic awareness, for example, is important in Spanish as it is in English. We know the syllabic awareness, of course, it's also important in Spanish. It is also in English, but maybe more in Spanish because of the consistency of the orthography. But it is phonemic awareness that gives us the best prediction on student reading comprehension in Spanish. And then decoding the same way, a decoding measure is ideal. A decoding measure that maybe uses nonsense word fluency is perhaps better than one that uses real words, just because then we don't know if when students are struggling, if it is because they don't understand the word, or is it because they just don't have strong decoding skills. No, so sometimes those nonsense word fluency measures or pseudo word measures might be better predictors of decoding. And then, of course, fluency. We have found that oral fluency is a strong predictor of Spanish and English reading comprehension. So that's also a measure that can be done in both languages. Okay, here, Shanasana, is syllable segmentation sufficient, or is it important to assess phoneme segmentation in Spanish? Very good question. I get that question quite a bit. And yes, we need to assess students in their phoneme segmentation. And the main reason is because for kindergarten and first grade, you know, the students will be mostly exposed to consonant vowel words, but as soon as they get in the middle of first grade, they're going to be exposed to a variety of words with different syllabic patterns and also multisyllabic words. Now, as you know, in Spanish, we have many more multisyllabic words than in English. And so if students don't have a strong understanding of the phonemes, they are going to be exposed to syllables that they have never seen before, and they are going to make mistakes by ignoring some of the letters within a syllable that they are not used to. The best example is, for example, consonant. If students only learn consonant vowel words, when they get to words like crema or blusa that have this double consonant at the beginning, they might ignore that, and they are going to make a mistake because they're not used to that pattern. And so if we focus only on the phonemes, or mostly on the phonemes without ignoring the syllables, I'm not saying that we should ignore syllables, then you can get a better way or a better understanding of how students are, their decoding skills. And I have one here, how early should explicit English reading skills be taught in an immersion or biliteracy program? Yeah, well, the issue is that we just don't know which program is the best and which program works, better for students, whether it's a transition program, a dual language, dual immersion, one way, or dual immersion two ways. From our experience working in schools, in bilingual schools in Oregon, we taught students to read in both languages since kindergarten. And it worked quite well, and students were developing their skills in both languages. So I think that we should not shy away from teaching students English in early, even in a bilingual program. That, of course, with the caveat that you want to be making sure that they are making growth, right, in both languages. And even, I think sometimes I see schools that maybe they do language proficiency development in English in the early grades and then kind of teach the code in Spanish. I mean, that's fine too, but ultimately what is nice about sometimes having students learn the code in both languages is that you can make those connections for them, right? Like, for example, we know that most consonants in Spanish and English, they sound the same. So we don't have to teach the code twice. So we can teach it, for example, in Spanish, and then help students make the connection to words in English. And that way, we kind of maximize a little bit the time that we have for teaching both languages. Okay. Let me see. Oh, how early should explicit instruction reading skills be taught in an immersion or biliteracy program? Oh, yeah, I just answered that. Yeah. What Spanish phonic intervention programs does everyone use out there? I'm always looking for a better one, more options. Yeah, yes, there are some. I'm an author on one of them, Phonetica, Bookshop Phonetica, but that doesn't mean that's the only one around. But I think that again, the important thing is to know that for example, if it's a phonics program, that it follows the phonics from Spanish, right? In Spanish. So, for example, the W and the X, we have very few words with W and X in Spanish. So you would not expect that those two letters and letter sounds would be taught in a Spanish program early, because there would be very little opportunity for students to practice those letter sounds. While in English, obviously, we have to kind of include them early, right, in the program, just because they are so, I mean, there are so many words that starts with the W and the X, yeah. All right, so I'm going to continue, and then I'm going to make a stop again to see if you have more questions about it. But yeah, please keep them coming in the chat, and then I'll respond to them also. All right, so how do we assess the language proficiency, right? And particularly in a way that is reasonable and understanding. And so I want to share with you like we're doing some studies on measures of vocabulary that we hope will be kind of easy to do. And I have some students actually practice them, implement them in their classroom, like in their kindergarten classroom, and with success. So I think that those might be good opportunities for students to learn, or for teachers to assess their students. And so here, just to give you an impression, so these were words that we presented to kindergartners. And how do you think kindergartners responded to these words? Do you have any suggestions, any thoughts that you can put on the chat about how would they define them? So one of the things, so some kindergartners said sway, hooling on the beach, baffled when you have to go to the bathroom, pursue, I don't know, you tell me, narrow, throwing up, haven, God's world. So so you see that's where kindergartners come with their ideas, what they think words are, no? And here, of course, the definitions. But what happens if we teach kids those words, particularly kindergartners, no? And here, I want to show you just a brief video, and I hope it will work, on kids learning a word in Spanish, apetito, appetite, that the teacher identified as an important word for kids to understand the book that they were reading. So let me see, hopefully this will work. Okay.
Are you able to raise the sound up?
So just to kind of, oh no, you can't hear it. All right.
Yep.
Oh, well, how can we do it? Well, I think that hopefully when you get the presentation, you can hear it. That hopefully, yeah. But here, basically, what the teacher is doing is she taught the word appetite with very plenty of different activities, examples, non-examples, discrimination, selection, repetition of the word. And then she asked students to practice it, what it meant. And so after students have been practicing the word and seeing it and hearing it with the read aloud, she assessed them to see how students were doing. And here, with a very simple measure, where basically she asked them what the word means and how they can use the word in a sentence. She noticed that almost all her students, with the exception of two, really improved their knowledge of those words 100%. So, and this was a very brief measure, right? Like what does the word mean? And tell me the word in a sentence, or use the word in a sentence, and they were able to do it, and those were kindergartners. And here's a little bit like the case of two students, and in their pre-assessment definition, they just one student knew something about polite, which was another one of the words, but then you can notice that the post-assessment, students had quite a bit to say about these words. For example, for appetite, they said it's when you feel like eating. Another student say today I have a lot of appetite. So they really were using the word, that you were defining it and also using it in a sentence in a way that really kind of gives us an idea about where they are in their language proficiency, particularly in the understanding of academic words. And I think that is a good way to try to quickly know whether students are learning the vocabulary that you're teaching them. Other ways that we can do it too is, for example, asking students to determine if Ellen Ochoa, or a famous character, this was within the context of a hero lesson, has, if you admire her or not, and then students can say yes or no, and then based on their language development, right, on their level, we can expand on that and say, well, why do you admire her? And that way students can expand their answer. And that would be also a quick way of knowing how students will respond, or whether, how much they know about the word. Another one that we have used too with even with parents is kind of like showing students a picture of a word, and then in the back we write the word. We can write a sentence with the word. We can also write the translation. And this kind of very quick assessment, and here, unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to share with you this video, but hopefully once you have it. But here the mom is doing a very quick assessment of her child's kind of like vocabulary words by showing her the card, and the girl says the meaning of the word. So it's very quick and easy way to assess language too. Now, the other thing is, like, how do we know, right? How do we know if a student has a language disability or a language development? And some of the guidelines could be like, for example, the student is not developing their language compared to other students in the classroom who with similar backgrounds, and that would be kind of a bit of a red flag. Really making sure that you're providing students with many opportunities to practice using language, either English or their native language. So sometimes, for example, in some studies that we have done, we have noticed that students sometimes don't talk, and particularly when they are English learners, we tend to maybe answer for them, and as an adult try to explain things for them, and so we reduce the amount of time that they have to actually practice the words. And sometimes even saying the words many times, writing it, saying the syllables of a word are good activities for them to develop what we call, and Perfetti has called, a mental representation of the word. So the more we hear, we use, we write, we talk about words, the stronger we have a mental representation of those words, which will help us then understand the words and then understand the context better. And then the other one is like, of course, the question, have students received small group instruction? No, because for an English learner, and particularly when you're developing language, small group instruction really helps also students feel more comfortable speaking the language. And then the students have slow growth, no, on curriculum measures. So I mean, even if it's a decoding measure, sometimes that can give us a little bit of an idea too, if it's decoding only, or if it's also maybe a factor of the language. Although, as I say, if you are teaching decoding to students, English learners and English only students, they should do equally well, or they should struggle equally, whether they are English proficient or an English learner. So now I'm going to go to teaching, like how do we really teach then English learners in white environment? But before I want to stop a minute just to see if anybody has questions. Any questions up to now? If he has not leaving. Okay, this has been mostly about programs that you can use, which is great. Yeah. Good, wonderful. Yes, yeah, I see that you are looking for phonics programs, and yes, I think it is really important and really make sure that students are developing their phonics in Spanish, because we do know, and we have done many studies where it is a strong predictor of reading comprehension, and so we don't want to ignore it in Spanish. Although we might think, oh yes, it has a transparent orthography, right? Like all the letter sounds, most of the letter sounds kind of map directly to a letter. It's not necessarily. It is important for them to know the code in Spanish. Yeah. Okay, so I see some questions now. Should screening of foundational skills be deferred until there's a minimum of English proficiency versus more scanned at the same time as English monolinguals? No, I think that foundational skills should be screened from the same way. If students make translation, maybe with the instructions, you can provide the translations as a modification, but they should be screened early. And because we want to know from the beginning, even if they know a few letter sounds, or even if they know a few sounds in a word, that already is helping us know where students are, right? Like the baseline. And then from there, build their skills. And if they don't produce anything, well, they need to be taught. I mean, that's the reality. They will need to be taught those skills. So it's not like necessarily that they are not understanding always the skill. It's more that they just might not have been exposed to it beforehand. And many of the English learners, they come and they start school in kindergarten. So not all of them go to the preschool. So they might not know anything, but that doesn't mean that they have a learning difficulty. It's just that they haven't been exposed to it. No instruction has not happened. So you're going to find that in the beginning of kindergarten, you're going to get lots of zeros from students, but as you start teaching them the code, they will then improve that for sure. Yeah. All right, so I think I might have made more slides than what I was anticipating, and I know I want to give a little bit more time also for questions, but I'm going to maybe talk, if that's okay, for about maybe 8 more minutes or so, and then I'll leave the time open for additional questions. And please keep them coming on the chat, and I can answer them as at the end. So now teaching English learners. No, so there's some common misconceptions that are important for us to know and realize. And one is that, for example, a child can learn a second language faster than an adult. And we have found that is not true, that adults can also learn a second language just the same way as a child. But the adult has different kind of knowledge, right? Like the adult can read, the adult can understand another language. They know the differences between one language and the other. So how you teach them and how they learn a second language is very different. But it doesn't mean that an adult cannot learn a language as fast as a child. In fact, sometimes faster or slower too, right? Yeah. Then for struggling English learners, learning two languages is confusing. We have not found that, and there's no real evidence. I mean, of course, if students are learning two languages, they are going to be bound to maybe making confusions or sometimes answering in Spanish when it is in English, but it is really because of that kind of because they are always bringing up both languages, right? Like we know from neuroscience, not because they are confused. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about students, for example, participating in a bilingual program since kindergarten and learning both languages. And then what is important, though, is that for the teacher to differentiate the languages. Now, sometimes what I have seen in classrooms is that teachers tend to code switch. And so although it's Spanish instruction, then they code switch to English and Spanish, and that can confuse students. So if the time is for teaching reading in Spanish, then reading in Spanish should only happen. And the teacher, of course, can help students who are making a mistake or who answer in English. I mean, that is perfectly fine, but try to avoid to code switch when you're teaching in one language. Now, the other thing too that is really important is that we don't want to also suppress students who might know the answer in their native language. So, for example, in some programs and some models, math is taught in English while reading is taught in Spanish. Sometimes even the rest of the day is taught in Spanish and then math is in English. Well, you can imagine that if students, and as we know, language has a strong impact on math outcomes. So if we're teaching math to students, word problems will be very complicated and much more complicated than even for a monolingual student. So allowing students to use their native language during math instruction is really helpful. And if the teacher is bilingual, I mean, that would be even better, no? Because if we want them to learn the content, we have to use all their assets that they have. And there should be no reason why bilingual students, for example, are struggling in math. No, I mean, the only reason they're struggling in math is because of the language. It's not because of the cognitive demands of math. And that is sometimes important to take into consideration, like how are we going to really support them in other content areas, not just reading, so that they can be successful too. And then there's a critical period for learning a language. There's not a critical period for learning a second language. Anybody can learn it anytime. So we don't have to worry about that. There's no evidence of the critical period. It is better that each parent speaks the child in one language instead of both languages. There's no evidence for that too. I mean, if you speak both languages, then, talking to your child in both languages is perfectly fine. Sometimes it's good, and if you want to foster their native language, then you can try and speak that language more than English as a second language. But it doesn't have to be necessarily like in a structured way, because what we want to avoid is students feeling constrained, and not using all their assets, their language proficiency assets to express themselves. And then academic language should come after social language. And we know that is not true. And in fact, it's really counterproductive, particularly when you think about learning content in kindergarten, right? Or in first grade. I mean, students need to learn content because otherwise they're going to fall behind. So we have to teach them social language as well as the academic language from the beginning. Okay. Here. All right, I'm going to skip through some slides just because of time. I didn't realize that we are, I think we still have time, but just kind of give it a little bit more time for questions. So what are the conditions for learning a second language? I think that this 6 elements here are really important. Now, one is providing a supportive environment, not really encouraging students to use their 2 languages. And then, starting from what the learner knows. So really find out where students learn this language, where they, how did they develop it, what kind of assets or characteristics of the families where they live are, all that influence the learning of the student. The more the student feels comfortable in the classroom, the more they will also learn and be motivated to learn and improve. Providing comprehensible input, and as I was saying, depending on the level of the language, we provide them with different supports based on that. Many practice opportunities, so really think about how you can have students practice their language in a variety of ways, and we don't have to wait for that. I mean, even the yes/no questions or pointing to things are important to do from the beginning. to, of course, try to be as motivating as possible, and so provide them with relevant information for the learner, and then really developing all their integrating all their areas of so cognition, content, and language together, so that it's not a separate thing. So language proficiency is not separate from content, but it's kind of really taught in the context of content. And then when we talked about, we talked about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 word tiers in the response to intervention approach. But we also, as you know, and Isabel Beck and Margaret McCown, they've talked about tier 2 words. But sometimes with English learners, it's important to see or to determine if they only need support with academic language, which is definitely the one that will bring them the most opportunities to understand content. But sometimes students can get stuck in words that maybe have a double meaning, or they are very simple, like, for example, fill or rest or duck, that have different meanings. And it's important to know that and to be aware that those might be the questions that the words that students might not understand and trip them. Anecdotally, I was talking to a teacher one time where the teacher asked the student to do a math problem. It was a kindergarten, and the teacher did not want to translate the problem because they thought, you should only teach it in English. And the question was like, how many apples are in each basket? And so the student did not understand what each was. And, there was the teacher did not want to translate it. And so the student consequently did not do the problem, did not solve the problem correctly. And this was like a really good example that if the student would have known, would have been explained the word in Spanish, they would have likely been able to complete the problem without any issues. And so we do have to be aware of that. And if students want to use their native language and you have the knowledge for that language, using it is perfectly fine. Some other things that are important, for example, here, and I want to go through all of them, but modeling the correct forms. So that modeling and explicit instruction really works for English learners. We have many studies that have evidence of that. So trying to really consider, like even if you want a student, for example, to respond to a question, modeling how you would respond to the question, it would really help the student understand too what they need to do. The other one is also trying to avoid like slangs, idioms, or jargon. And sometimes we do it without even noticing. For example, one of the things that we typically do is say "eyes on me," right? The teacher says "eyes on me" because she wants students to pay attention, to her. But when you translate it, when you think about it, and let's say thinking it from a second language learner perspective, it's kind of weird, right? I mean, like eyes, we put the eyes on you, like, do we actually take our eyes and put them there? Like, it doesn't have that meaning that we want. It's like, oh, pay attention, like listen to what I'm saying. And so those kind of things that we just do because we're used to using those idioms sometimes can really trip students, The other one is sometimes a little bit avoiding sarcasm or irony. I was looking at one time at one program, a reading program, and the first story that they had in second grade was a story where you needed to really understand the irony to be able to follow it. And it was about eating habits, and eating healthy. And the examples that the story was giving about eating healthy, because it was a joke kind of thing, was eating ketchup and fudge popsicles and popcorn. And so students did not know, at least the students that I had who were English learners, they didn't understand why that was a problem. Why that was funny, And so that kind of like irony and sarcasm is sometimes the most difficult thing for English learners to understand. Okay. And then I have a lot of examples here of kind of direct vocabulary instruction that I'm going to skip, but you're welcome to look at them and see what they are. But the main thing is, Oh, yeah. So I'm going to just to finalize, I'm going to talk a little bit about error correction too, because like, how do you correct errors, right? For English learners, you don't want them to feel bad. You don't want them to feel like they don't understand and that's why they are being penalized, no? But we do know that, for example, for discrete skills like phonics or phonemic awareness, error correction procedures are really important, and correcting errors immediately is important and necessary so that students understand what they did wrong and don't get misconceptions. So when you're teaching decoding to English learners, just like English only students, you stop them and then you do the my turn, right? You model the correct answer. So my turn, the sound is repeat what sound or what word. And then we do a little bit of a delay test to see if students actually remember the sound, you know? So it's very direct. It's always going to my turn. It's not like, no, your answer is wrong, but going to my turn and then providing students many opportunities to practice what they did wrong correctly. Now, when it's language, when we have correct language issues, then we have to decide what is the focus of the lesson, no? And for example, if a student just learned a word, like the word admire, that is the example that I used here in some of the slides we're going to see afterwards. If that is the issue, then you want to correct immediately. No, if the student doesn't know admire, we have been talking about that, you can say, oh, my turn. And no, admire means to like or to like somebody who has done something very special. No, and so have students then also repeat that that vocabulary definition. Now, if you have never taught it, one of the things that I think we have to avoid with particular vocabulary is asking students what they know about the word. And although sometimes we want to build that background knowledge and by asking that question, the problem is that sometimes with that question, it can bring, like, students might make mistakes, and then it's very difficult to correct that mistake because, you know, we're asking students what they know about the word. So the best way then to teach direct vocabulary instruction is to actually tell students first the student-friendly definition, and then do lots of activities, and then we can ask them what the word means. And that way, all students will have the correct definition from the beginning. And then, important to correct and to repeat what students say correctly. And then recognize that sometimes errors might be not because students don't know grammar, for example, or syntax, but it might be a first language interference, no? Like in this case of this sentence, adentro había un pino de Navidad muy grande, which is saying, you know, inside there was a big Christmas tree. The student translated it and he has one tree of Christmas very big. And that was not because the student probably doesn't know the grammar, but it was because they were using their native language influence to write the sentence. You know? So all those things are important to take into account. So just then to summarize, consider that English language proficiency levels when you're planning your activities. Consider multiple ways of expanding student oral language proficiency. So what activities can you do to expand what they know and what they can produce? Determine which errors you're going to correct and which ones are not. So with language development, you don't want to correct all the errors, but target the errors that you think will be important for students, for example, to understand content. And then determine the assessments of content and language that provide information of student understanding. So see, okay, how are you going to measure student understanding or language development, no, in a content area? Or how are you going to assess their decoding skills of a text that you just gave them? And then as we were talking about decoding or fluency, you can use the same measures as you would use with English proficient students. And just here, I added a few videos and also resources for you in terms of what I have been talking about, and some also selected references for you to see. But this would be all.